Now from a reverend who was a magistrate back to a general who became a governor and one who followed Brisbane. The man was Lieutenant General Ralph Darling. He took control and was Captain General of New South Wales from the time Brisbane left in 1825 until 1831. The man was characterised by a soft, round face, not quite the stereotypical soldier we know, but looks were deceiving. He was courageous nevertheless. Now, as usual, he arrived at the end of December in 1825 into a typically humid, hot summer in Sydney. He was a calm man in times of stress and worry, of which there were many instances to challenge him. Darling had a good effect initially on John Macarthur and the Chief Justice Francis Forbes, of whom we'll talk about in another video. So, first appearances with the Wool Baron and Chief Justice respectively were good, great. Few ticks there. They saw in front of them an intelligent face, a listener, and a quick absorber of the facts that confronted the new governor on the shores of Sydney Cove. The Darlings stayed with the Forbes for the first 3 weeks, and while the Lieutenant General had a pleasing effect on Francis Forbes, he had the opposite effect on Mrs. Forbes, who considered him to be dictatorial and overbearing. However, all was not beer and skittles, because John Macarthur Jr. had written to his father, and I quote, that Darling's manners were so cold and repulsive that it would be difficult to become intimate with him. Wow. As mentioned previously, he was a soldier, and he was the son of a soldier. And like many of the senior people, especially officers, he had fought in the Peninsular Wars, and he had fought with distinction. He accepted the appointment as Commander of Troops in Mauritius, where he had defended the slaves of a sugar plantation, an act which would prove to be controversial in his future career in New South Wales. His wife, Eliza, was a powerful woman to such an extent we'll have our own video on her. Now, Darling was a little bit of a mover and shaker to a point. He was still a Tory, a Conservative. And he was the first to introduce the idea of an executive council, something like a cabinet that would be a group of selected individuals, talented and experienced, who could advise him on the way forward for the colony. This was another first. Another one for Darling was to consider the issue of licences for the various newspapers, which Lord Bathurst had recommended. Now, this would need a change of the law of New South Wales and be passed through the Legislative Council. At the time, there were 3 newspapers in the colony: the Gazette, run by Mr. Howe, the Monitor, run by Mr. Hall, and the Australian, run by William Charles Wentworth and Robert Wardell. In April 1827, Darling instructed 2 bills in the Legislative Council to control the press. There was much controversy, discussion and argument over the contents. We have to remember that the likes of Wentworth, Marsden and John Macarthur were open in their criticism. They were vitriolic in their attacks on the governors from an early time. It was this criticism that filtered up to the people in London, and the governors of the colony were displeased at the situation. They weren't happy that London knew what was going on in New South Wales. So the old chestnut of the government trying to strangle the press so that they wouldn't be able to criticise them arises once again. Sounds familiar today. We have similar sort of talk. Now, we did talk about the Reverend Scott in the previous video and how he had been attacked in the press, especially the Australian. Scott wanted protection from Darling, who refused. John Macarthur also called on Darling for protection against the slanders of his family in the Sydney Gazette. Darling again refused. So again, like Wentworth, Governor Darling was perhaps naive, or at best not understanding the power that certain individuals had in the colony and how those individuals could influence dramatic change. Now, he was to rue these decisions, he was to regret them. In April 1828, Darling again, to congratulate his courage in this, wanted to extend the power of the Legislative Council by having juries in the trial of all crimes. Up to that stage, magistrates were the sole arbitrator of guilt or innocence. The bill passed and received royal assent on the 25th of July. Further to that, another controversial aspect arose about the composition of juries. Up to that time, attendance on a jury was based on wealth and property and income, and only open to immigrants. The issue was fanned in controversy for a few years. The governor, being from the army, had a consistent and black and white view of punishment. Now, there was a convict named Sudds, S-U-D-D-S, who we'll talk about in another video, a very sad and tragic affair, and his alleged mistreatment and illness. The whole incident had a staining effect on Darling. Whether he acted with good judgment or poor is irrelevant. As we say today, the optics weren't good. So we leave the governor now in 1828, and we'll revisit him later to reveal his last 3 years as Captain General of the colony of New South Wales, the way he governed, and in the controversial circumstances of his departure and exit. I'm Michael Bichel. I'll see you next time on this exciting period of 19th century Sydney. Thanks.